Hello. Welcome to Play by Play. My name is Sean Bouchard. It is Wednesday, May 6th. That's the date. And we got a lot going on tonight. I'm super really excited about this. We're going to start off, we're going to do Q&A about Among the Sleep, which we played on Monday. My cat is going crazy. Playing with a little stuffed beaver toy that I got for her in Canada. So we're going to do a Q&A about Among the Sleep, and then we are going to finish Shelter, the last section of Shelter, and then we're going to play Royals, which I'm super excited about, and then we'll do a Q&A about all of the everything. Yeah, let's get started. Among the Sleep, holy cow, guys, that was such a really good game. I enjoyed that so much, and there was a really fantastic discussion about it on the forum afterwards, which I found super exciting. So I got a ton of questions, and I am certain that I don't have time to answer them all, but I'll answer a few of them that I thought were especially interesting, or I had particularly interesting answers for, and we'll see where that gets us. So these are all questions that were asked on the forum in the Q&A thread since Monday, since we finished the game. Here's one from Celia. It isn't as important now. I thought this was an interesting question. It isn't as important now, but I would have liked to hear you talk about previous experience with horror games before starting on Among the Sleep. Have you played any? Do you seek out or avoid the genre? This is a really interesting question to me. I haven't played a ton of horror games. It depends on where you draw the line, like what you define as horror. I've played a little bit of Amnesia. I've played like minutes of Dead Space. Horror games. I've played like a couple. Like I played a little bit of the Japanese game with the photography that I can't think of the name of. Didn't play Silent Hill, didn't play Resident Evil. Didn't play much of like Dead Space. That's a classic, right? But I have a particular taste in what I enjoy when it comes to horror, and I enjoy sort of atmospheric and psychological horror as opposed to like gory horror, slasher horror. And this kind of cuts across media. Although it's also weird. I have a weird relationship with horror, especially in film. But not just in film. I find it fascinating, and I usually don't like it, but I like thinking about it. I read like the Wikipedia pages for a lot of horror movies that I will never watch. And there are some like excellent horror movies that I enjoy, like Cabin in the Woods is fantastic, and it obviously draws on like knowledge of a lot of horror tropes, and so I'm fairly decently versed in horror tropes because I find the genre fascinating. I just don't especially enjoy watching it, and I really don't enjoy people getting like slaughtered. On the other hand, I couldn't stop watching The Cell. I told the story about how I watched The Cell in high school over the course of like 4 days because I couldn't stand to watch it more than 15 or 20 minutes at a time, but I also couldn't stop. I have that kind of relationship with that kind of movie. No, that's Cube. Sorry, that's Cube. The Cell, the Jennifer Lopez movie, I hate that movie. There's a part of me that is just so fascinated by it, but it makes me so uncomfortable. I don't enjoy it. I'm not super thrilled about the idea of playing Dead Space, but I a game like Among the Sleep, where there's an atmospheric horror, I enjoy that very much. A game like, BioShock, or what's another good one that has like horror themes? Well, I don't know. I can't think of one right now, but that kind of thing, like where it's not really. I'm hard pressed to call that a horror game, but it certainly draws on elements of horror. And Among the Sleep is a horror game, but it's a storytelling horror game. Oh, Gone Home is another one that's great. That, like, I mean, what would you call that? Would you call that a horror game? I mean, that's what it's doing. That's what it's about. Um, but it's not. At the same time, it's not really. Um, so yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. I have a weird, I guess, history and attachment to the idea of horror games. Um, yeah. Okay, so Caged Tiger had a question. I noticed that you had a lot of signs of physical immersion when playing the game, such as whispering when the bear told you to be quiet, and covering your face with your hands when things got scary. Do you think that level of immersion, strong physical reaction, was due to the strong embodiment of being a toddler, the fear of being in a horror game, or some bit of both? I wanted to answer this because I think it's a bit of both of those things. And also a third thing, which is performance. So I'm playing this game. I was very aware of the fact that I was on camera and that I was, casting to an audience of people who were watching me. So that definitely affected sort of how I behaved, and not to say that like any of that was affected in a you know not to say that like any of that wasn't genuine reaction, but it was also performed in the same way that like kind of all social interaction is performed at some level. It was heightened, or it was sort of made more conscious because of the fact that I was conscious of the audience that was watching. So I think those two things that Caged Tiger identified, that I absolutely had an embodiment, and I also had an emotional response to just the atmosphere of the game, and I also was sort of performing the game for an audience, and I think all three of those things contribute to the way that I was physically immersed. Okay, here's several sort of questions along the lines of drawing parallels between Among the Sleep and Papoyo, which, if you haven't seen it, Papoyo was the first game that I did a play-by-play on back in February, and it was a really, really interesting game. It was really interesting, fun to talk about. Also about a child dealing with an alcoholic, abusive parent through sort of trappings of fantasy. There's a lot of really strong parallels between the two stories. Some of the key differences between them, in Papoyo, instead of being 2 years old, the main character is probably, I actually don't remember if this was addressed, but more like in the 8 to 10-year-old range. And instead of the mother, it's the father, who is an alcoholic. And it's yeah, I think, and then the way that it ends is pretty different too. Um, and the way that the game plays out, it's a very different game. Like it's not this kind of like horror game. It's a third-person puzzle platformer that is much more whimsical. Somebody used to describe it. I think that's absolutely accurate. And it sometimes gets scary, and it sometimes gets like it certainly has a lot of emotional punch, but it tends to back away from that in a different way than, or at least to approach it in a different way than Among the Sleep does. Part of the big difference in my mind is that in Papoio, the character of the father, instead of being sort of like a monster that is hidden in the shadows, that is just out to get you, is a character who's around sort of all the time. This dichotomy that Among the Sleep explores, where the mother seems like two different characters, that's not a thing in Papoio. In Papoio, there's like you follow the monster character around, and interact with him like all the time. But there are also other sort of like deeper parallels, or maybe not deeper, maybe more surface, but sort of like stranger, I guess. In that, for example, in both of these games, you have a toy companion who is there to kind of like help you figure out how to play the game, and also offers you protection, and at a climactic moment is broken, and sort of, can no longer help you, and that is part of your journey towards reconciling the fantasy and the reality. Which is sort of a weird thing. Like it's not obvious that that's a necessary piece, a necessary element to telling this, fundamental story. I think, I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say. I think to some extent that might be coincidence, because I don't think it is like fundamentally necessary. I think you could have a game that didn't have like a toy companion, but at the same time, I think it's like convergent design, right? Like convergent evolution. I would imagine that these two games came from different places and converged on a solution to a design problem of, wanting to help the player navigate the emotional and narrative landscape in a particular way. And the easiest way to do that in a lot of cases is to have a companion character who, from a game design standpoint, from a like mechanical level design standpoint, can help introduce you to the things that you're supposed to be able to do to interact with the world, and can guide you towards like your next goal, or help you figure out exactly what's going on. And from a narrative standpoint, is somebody who can reflect at least an emotional tone through conversation, can sort of set like an idea of how you are supposed to be feeling, or what you're supposed to be thinking about. Having a companion character is, it's just an insanely powerful payoff from a design perspective. And the downside is that it's overdone. Like, it's done all the time. Companion characters are in games everywhere. And Navi and Cortana are the ones that I always bring up. But GLaDOS actually is an example of one. This appears over and over and over again in games, this sort of like companion character that fills this role because it's so effective. So it doesn't really surprise me that they wanted something to fill that role. And then once you're at that point, if you're dealing with a child and a child's story and a child's fantasy story, the idea of a toy that comes to life isn't that much of a reach. I think that's sort of where that comes from. Celia had a really good point about how the two games use interactive and cinematic techniques differently. Basically saying that Papoio uses a lot of interaction with the world and with the character of the alcoholic father. Whereas uh, uh, Among the Sleep tends to rely more heavily on cinematic tricks where you are not directly interacting with the world, but you're being presented with a scene. So I would include in this like things almost like set dressing, but like very linear paths through the world where we're going to flash lights and we're going to have sound cues in very specific places. And then occasionally we're going to take camera control away from you and just like play out a scene. Where you're being carried around or something like that, or you're falling through a hole. That doesn't happen as much, certainly not proportionally, in Papoio. And Papoio is much more about solving environmental puzzles that are frequently more than just like collect all of the items that you need. And they frequently require you uh, to understand and manipulate the monster character, the alcoholic father character. So I mean, I guess I'm supposed to comment on that. I think that that's like a really excellent observation. I think it's absolutely true that the two games have different approaches to how they're telling similar stories, and some of that has to do with the way that they're approaching them from completely different angles. The tenor of Papoio is very, very different than that of Among the Sleep. Among the Sleep is a much more like suspenseful, uh, um, uh, you know, uh, terror kind of a story, whereas Papoio is heart-wrenching, but it's usually not like terrifying. It's very much about sort of coming to terms. Okay, so then Caged Tiger sort of also made a really, I'm stumbling into this. Caged Tiger made a fantastic um, comparison where uh, Among the Sleep is a game about revealing something, revealing the problem, the identity, the sort of source of trauma for the character. Um, and Papoio is a game about confronting that problem. And it's I think that's like 100% true. And those are two very different sort of stances for a game to take, and that is, I mean, if anything, like I would say that's the fundamental experience design goal for these two games. One is about sort of the revelation. Among the Sleep is about revelation, and Papoio is about confrontation. And all of these design decisions, sort of all of the things that are different about them, the way that Among the Sleep is much more of a horror game, the way that it's sort of lit, the way that it uses cinematics versus Papoio, I think comes from the difference in that fundamental experience goal. You guys should really just look at the forum where people have talked about this better than I'm doing. Here's a thing though. In Among the Sleep, the mother compared to the father in Papoio, which of those characters was more sympathetic? And this was a question that Dreaming of an Electric Sheep raised. Wow, I can say that. And I think that they were of the opinion that the mother in Among the Sleep was portrayed as a more sympathetic character, and that the her abuse towards the child was mostly emotional, whereas the abuse of the father towards the protagonist in Papoio was physical. And I don't know that I agree with that. I actually think that that's a really interesting question. Which of those, how sympathetic were those characters, and which was portrayed as more sympathetic? But I would say, from a player perspective at least, that Monster in Papoio is more sympathetic. simply by virtue of the fact that I bonded with him. I had a relationship with him, whereas I never, through the mechanics of the game, through the action of the game, had a relationship, had like any kind of rapport with the mother character. The mother was always either an objective or something that I was running away from. So it was sort of like an environmental force that was this, the mother was represented by some kind of a abstract environmental force, whereas the father in Papoyo was somebody that I interacted with directly, and that I helped and who helped me. My relationship with that character was actually more like my relationship with the bear in Among the Sleep, which I, throughout the whole game, like, the bear ended up being nothing but friendly, but I had a kind of like, this guy's creepy, but at the same time, I'm really becoming not just dependent, but rapport, I think, is a really good word. I'm building rapport through action and through sort of the mechanics of the game with the character. And that's how I felt about Monster in Papoyo. And it's absolutely not how I felt about the mother in Among the Sleep. Okay, another question from Celia. How does the game change by having the mother as a McGuffin? Kind of what I just addressed, but also in the sense of like an open world versus linearity. And the words that Celia used were escaping versus searching. And actually, I don't have the full context here, so I forget exactly what was said. But I really liked that contrast between those two words, escaping and searching, partially because it made me think about the moment in Among the Sleep when we were through the like introductory level and into the first world, the playground world. And for a little while at the beginning, it seemed like I had found the thing that I was looking for, and now I was no longer searching, I was escaping. And then it turned out that wasn't the case, that I just found like a piece of a puzzle, and the thing that I was looking for was way down at the end of the line, and actually like my whole interaction with that space was going to be searching for the end. But I think that difference, like, as we pointed out in that moment, there's a difference in those two experiences, even if the mechanics of the world are pretty much exactly the same. So you don't even need to go into open world versus linear world to have that experience of how and why am I traversing the world? Is it because I'm looking for something, or is it because I'm trying to get away from something? And those are both experiences that you can create. I think that ultimately, Among the Sleep is a game about revealing this truth at the end, and so the fact that you are searching for it makes sense. And there are definitely parts where like you're running away from a monster, and especially as the game gets later and later, there's more and more of that. The monster makes more and more of an appearance. But for the most part, you have a goal and you're trying to achieve that goal. And I think that sort of fits into this mentality of you're searching for some kind of an underlying truth. You're trying to find the piece of the puzzle that's going to make it all make sense, as opposed to escaping, which I don't know how that compares to Papoyo. Actually, I don't know if it compares meaningfully. There are definitely parts of that game where you are escaping. Because once monster becomes enraged, you just have to like run away, and so that's, I don't know, maybe because that's more confrontational, it better fits the experience of confrontation that I think that game is going after. I just found those two words and that dichotomy of thinking about your motivation as a player navigating space, escaping versus searching. I found that really evocative. So thought that was interesting. A couple other questions from Celia. Do you think the game's length was appropriate? I liked this game's length a lot. I personally really enjoy short games. On the other hand, I liked Papoyo quite a bit, and that was a game that was, I think, like 8 hours, maybe 6 to 8 hours, something like that. So a little bit longer, uh, like maybe 3 times as long, something along those lines. Papoyo, I felt like maybe didn't need to be quite as long as it was in order to get its point across. But I thought that Among the Sleep maybe was a little bit rushed. And not much, but especially the ending, I didn't love the ending as much as I loved the rest of the game. And part of that is, I think, because it happens very, very quickly and there's no sense of sort of consequence to it. And I think that story could have played out a little bit longer. It could have unrolled a little bit slower and would have had more emotional weight. I will definitely say that, like, emotionally, Papoyo's climax and ending, the resolution of that game, hit me harder than the resolution of Among the Sleep. Even though Among the Sleep was more emotionally gripping throughout the entire experience than Papoyo. And that's actually a thing that I think you have to really consider. Among the Sleep is extremely stressful to play. Because you're constantly on edge. You're sort of afraid around every corner, like what's going to happen. Even though it's not mentally, it's not logically taxing. It's not like there's not the element of puzzle solving to it where you're trying to figure things out and you're like intellectually reasoning through things the way that you do in Papoyo. It's very emotionally taxing. And so having a game that's 8 hours long, where you are sort of dialed up to 10 like that the whole time, that's typically not good design. Like if Among the Sleep was longer, I would expect it to have more variation and like deeper valleys of, okay, things are all right now, you can calm down before we get started again. Papoyo, I think, benefits from the fact that it can be a long, slow burn. And so you're not as emotionally engaged at a moment in the gameplay, like for most of the game, but you're developing these emotional connections that then can be exploited at the climax to create a really strong emotional effect at the end of the game. And then a really important question: would the game have been better if you were able to play the xylophone? Which I think was meant as sort of a joke question, because I wanted to play the xylophone and I couldn't. But it's actually kind of an interesting question to take seriously, because it gets at this idea of what is a level of simulation that's appropriate for a given game. So I'm torn on the actual answer to this. On the one hand, would the game have been better if I could play the xylophone? Yes, because I wanted to play the xylophone. I was disappointed that I couldn't, and it took me out of the game a little bit. But no, because I think it's necessary to draw a line somewhere. I think a game that aims at 100% fidelity with like the real world is losing its entire range of ability to make an artistic statement. Um, so, I mean, I think even if it were possible to have true fidelity and have like every object in the world be perfectly interactable, like it was a real object, that isn't a desirable thing. And so you need to, as a designer, draw a line somewhere and separate what are the things that are important, what are the things that we want to model, and what are the things that aren't important. Um, and I think so. You're basically choosing like what is the scope of your simulation of the real world, and what are you abstracting out of that. And I think it makes sense in this game that playing the xylophone is not a core feature of the experience of playing the game. I think seeing the xylophone was, because the xylophone then comes back in the Rainbow Bridge. And so sort of like having that as an element of a game, a narrative element. But I don't know that the game would have actually benefited. I don't know that the experience of the game, of the like the tension of the game or the sense of revelation at the end would have benefited from uh, that level of fidelity of me actually of the game actually simulating the xylophone. So I think that's actually kind of an interesting question of like where does a game choose to draw that line, and does it feel like it's an appropriate place? God, there's so many questions and I'm skipping so many good questions. Sorry. Okay, one that I definitely want to get to, because this was hit on a couple of different places. Does your perception of the game change if you consider the child as female? There was a bunch of discussion about gender, and the way that the game handles and avoids handling the question of gender. One thing that was very clear to me and was clear to some other people as well was that the protagonist, the toddler, the 2-year-old baby, is not explicitly gendered by the game. And there are different cues that you can use to draw different conclusions. They wear blue pajamas or like some kind of a blue outfit, which suggests potentially a boy. But the paintings that we see in the water level and in sort of the water storybook world depict a woman and a girl, which to me sort of strongly suggests that a parallel to the protagonist, and suggests that might be a little girl. On the other hand, my reading of the box art for the game, which is the only time that you see the protagonist from outside, from third person, reads as a little boy. So there's definitely ambiguity to it. And that's something that, because I was talking throughout the game and sort of describing the protagonist, I was very aware that the game hadn't provided me with like an obvious answer to that question. One of my thoughts on that is that it only really became an issue for me because I was talking so much about the character. And so I cared about how I was going to reference that protagonist character as like he or she. But actually playing the game and role playing as a 2-year-old, I did not find it difficult at all to play sort of a gender neutral or a gender ambiguous child. And I think part of that for me is that at that age, I don't feel such a strong sense of gender identity that that becomes like a really necessary surface level part of how I would role play the character. thinking about that character as male or female doesn't really change the way that I think about inhabiting them, and certainly like a lot of the role playing was embodied, was physical, and was physically driven, and we talked a lot about that while playing the game. I don't think any of that changes based on the gender of the character. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think it's really interesting that the game leaves it ambiguous. But actually, for me, for the player experience, it didn't seem to matter a whole lot. It's a more of an interesting academic question than I found it to be a question that affected the experience strongly. Um, I'm skipping so many really good questions about the. There was a really great thing, I can't find it now, about how the first section, the sort of introductory section, is really good about making you feel like you're 2 years old, like you're a toddler, and then the dream world sections after that. That's not as much a factor. That isn't as strong, and it almost feels like, or it looks like, any other game. You could almost be playing Skyrim. It doesn't have the same like really strong sense of you're a tiny person who's crawling around, and you're obviously 2 years old, and you're not like an adult. And I agree with that. I mean, I think that there is still some sense of that, and there are lots of environmental cues, and certainly the interaction kept me aware of the difference between walking and crawling. Like that was a big thing, but it's definitely stronger in the introduction, and I felt okay with that. I felt like the introduction set up like my mental framework for how I was going to experience the rest of the game. And so at that point, I was kind of locked into I am 2 years old. And so the subsequent sections, I didn't feel the need for the game to emphasize that point so much, because it had already sort of locked that in for me. And so yeah, like some of those later sections, it doesn't feel especially like you're a tiny little toddler crawling around. But for me, for the experience of it, I was definitely still kind of in that mindset. Gosh, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ending. There's commentary on the forum about it's brief, and it's also kind of, I don't know. I found it to be a little bit unnaturally neat. The sort of father character, whoever the character is that appears at the end and sort of rescues you. I felt like that was not emotionally satisfying. I thought that like there's much more. Um, it would be a much more interesting ending, I guess, to really explore the repercussions of the situation that we've just revealed. But at the same time, the game's not really about exploring those repercussions. It's about the revelation. It's about the discovery. And so, like, I don't want an enormous amount more. I guess I was kind of bothered by this, father figure, whoever he is, who appears to save the day, who is not in any way embodied, who has no physical form, who's just sort of like, some glowing light, and who doesn't seem to have an emotional investment, who is nice, who's like fundamentally nice, and says that he'll take care of you, and I have no reason not to believe that, but doesn't seem upset at the condition that he finds you in, or there's no tension between him and the mother on his side. which doesn't seem believable to me. That just seems very strange. It seems like I don't know. I wasn't totally satisfied with that part of the ending. Um, I don't know. Maybe there's more discussion of these things to be had on the forum. The one thing that I really, really, really want to point you towards, and I'm not going to read the whole thing, but Fox Stash has a fantastic analysis from a sort of neurological development standpoint of interpreting what the game sort of metaphorically represents, that is fascinating and 100% definitely worth a read. Check that out on the forum, undefinedbehavior.com/forum. I highly recommend looking at that. And there's other really interesting conversation there that's worth looking at as well. Okay, I've been talking for too long about Among the Sleep. I'm going to go now to a brief break, and then we're going to play the second half of Shelter. I'm not going to take questions, I think, because we're just doing one more section of Shelter, and then we're going to play a different game, and then we're going to have Q&A. So I think I'm just going to do a Q&A at the end of Royals tonight. So I'll be back in just a minute, and we'll do some Badger. We'll be Badgers. All right. Bye.